It all started when a man in rural Texas failed to show up for work. In most cases, that might mean someone overslept, forgot their phone, or decided to take the day off without telling anyone. But this time, the silence didn't pass. The hours kept moving, and still, nothing. No response to calls, no reply to messages. By noon, coworkers stopped assuming there was a simple explanation and started worrying that something was wrong. That concern led to a welfare check at a home in Mico, a small community in Medina County. And that single decision, one coworker asking deputies to go see if everything was okay, would open the door to a case so cold and disturbing that even seasoned investigators were left with one question they still couldn't fully answer. Why? The house belonged to Stephen Ravine and his wife, Cherry Ravine. When deputies arrived that afternoon, the place did not look like the site of some obvious emergency. There was no shattered glass, no door hanging open, no immediate sign of a violent struggle spilling out into the yard. From the outside, it was quiet, almost too quiet. No one answered the door. That alone might not have meant much. But then deputies noticed something that changed the tone of the entire call. At the curb in a trash can, there were items that appeared to be bloody. Suddenly, this was no longer a simple welfare check. Investigators were called in. A closer look at the property turned up additional signs that something had gone very wrong inside that home. At that point, Stephen and Cherry weren't just missing. There was now reason to believe they may already have been victims of a crime. Authorities obtained a search warrant and started piecing together what they could from the scene. The evidence suggested foul play. But there was still one massive problem. The couple was gone, and they weren't the only ones. Also missing was Cherry's biological daughter, 29-year-old Cassandra Lange. Investigators began identifying the vehicles connected to the Ravine home, hoping one of them might give them a direction. They didn't have to wait long. Using available tracking technology, law enforcement located one of Stephen Ravine's vehicles far from Medina County, heading toward the Corpus Christi area. That changed everything. A case that had begun as a quiet, uncertain welfare check suddenly became a live manhunt. Later that same day, Corpus Christi police located the vehicle and stopped it. Inside were Cassandra Lange, a man named Joby Williams, and two very young children, a 6-year-old girl and a 1-month-old infant. And this is where the case takes on an even darker edge, because by this point, investigators weren't just trying to locate two missing adults. They were now looking at the possibility that the daughter of one of the victims had fled in the victim's vehicle, with children in the back seat, after something violent had happened at the family home. Lange and Williams were taken in for questioning. At first, the facts were still incomplete. Investigators knew there had likely been violence at the house. They knew the victims were missing, they knew one of their vehicles had been taken, and they knew the people inside that car were almost certainly connected to whatever had happened. Then came the statement that changed the entire investigation. According to authorities, Cassandra Lange confessed that she and Joby Williams had killed her mother and stepfather and had disposed of their bodies in a ravine. With that, the case stopped being a missing persons mystery and became a double homicide investigation. And what makes that moment especially chilling is how fast everything moved from there. The original welfare check happened at around 1 p.m. By roughly 7 p.m. that same day, only about 6 hours later, two suspects had been identified, located, interviewed, and taken into custody. It was an extraordinarily rapid unraveling of a crime that might otherwise have taken days to understand. But one of the most haunting parts was still ahead. Once Lange allegedly admitted that the bodies had been dumped, investigators immediately turned their attention to the Medina Lake area. As evening set in and daylight faded, deputies began searching ravines and dry creek beds near FM 1283. The area is rugged, uneven, and in places heavily concealed by brush. It was not the kind of location where someone would casually notice anything unusual from the road. At some point during that search, a deputy spotted what appeared to be trash. It was down a steep ravine, hidden by cedar brush and invisible from the roadway above. Deputies had to push through the brush and descend roughly 73 feet into the ravine to reach it. There, authorities found two large black garbage bags. Inside were the bodies of Cherry and Stephen Ravine. Think about how calculated that is. Not left in the open, not abandoned somewhere obvious, not placed where discovery seemed inevitable. According to investigators, the bodies had been taken to a location concealed enough that if no one had talked, if no one had led police there, the search could have taken much longer. The ravine was remote, hidden, deliberate. And that word, deliberate, hangs over every part of this case. According to Sheriff Randy Brown, investigators believe Cherry Ravine was killed first on Monday evening inside the family home. Then when Stephen returned home from work, he too was killed. Authorities said the killings did not appear accidental or spontaneous. Investigators recovered multiple weapons, and the sheriff indicated that strangulation and a knife were involved, though the medical examiner was left to determine the official causes of death. That alleged sequence is especially disturbing because it suggests not a sudden eruption of chaos, but a timeline, a progression, one victim first, then the second later, which means Stephen may have come home with no idea that anything had already happened inside his own house. No warning, no chance to avoid it. Just the ordinary act of returning home after work and stepping into something fatal. Investigators also said items had been taken from the residence, including guns, money, tools, and the victim's vehicle. Authorities began tracing the missing firearms and checking pawn shops for stolen property. That introduced another possible layer to the crime. Was this partly about theft? Was there a financial motive? Was the killing tied to some effort to take property and leave quickly? Maybe, but investigators were careful not to overstate what they knew. Because even with a confession, even with the suspects in custody, even with the bodies recovered and evidence collected, the central mystery of the case remained frustratingly incomplete. There was still no clear explanation for why a daughter would allegedly kill her own mother and stepfather, and then travel away from the scene with two children in the vehicle. That absence of motive is what gives this case its unnerving weight. A lot of violent crimes come with a visible emotional trail. There's an argument, a custody dispute, a financial collapse, a public feud, some obvious personal crisis that at least helps outsiders understand what drove the violence. It doesn't excuse it, but it creates a framework. Here, that framework seemed missing. Authorities did not provide a detailed explanation of the relationship between Lange and Williams, nor did they publicly establish a clear motive in the immediate aftermath. The sheriff openly said he could not speculate on why it happened. And sometimes that is more frightening than any answer. Because when there is no clear motive, the imagination fills in the blanks. People start searching for hidden resentments, long-building family tensions, secret conflicts, anything that could explain how a mother and stepfather ended up dead and discarded in black trash bags in a ravine near a lake. But the facts that were known were already horrifying enough. A co-worker realizes Stephen is missing. Deputies arrive at the house and find signs of blood. Investigators trace the victim's vehicle to another city. Inside that vehicle are the victim's daughter, another adult suspect, and two children. Then comes a confession, then a nighttime search, then a steep descent into a ravine, then two bodies hidden in black bags. And through all of it, there is this overwhelming sense of calm in the middle of brutality, as if the crime itself wasn't driven by panic, but by something colder. That may be the detail that lingers most. Not just the violence, but the apparent composure around it. Authorities said Williams initially gave an inconsistent account. Lange, meanwhile, allegedly confessed. The children found in the vehicle were taken into protective care, with the older child later transferred to her biological father and the infant placed in Child Protective Services custody as the legal process unfolded. So at the center of this homicide case, there were not only two dead victims and two accused killers, but also children old enough and young enough to be caught in the aftermath of something they could not possibly understand. That is one of the cruelest realities of crimes like this. The damage doesn't stop with the victims. It spreads outward, into families, into agencies, into courtrooms, into the lives of children who will grow up knowing they were physically present in the shadow of a double murder case. Lange and Williams were ultimately charged with capital murder in the deaths of Cherry and Stephen Ravine. Bond amounts reportedly changed as the case developed, eventually rising significantly as the seriousness of the allegations came into full view. Authorities emphasized the speed and coordination of the investigation, crediting the work of deputies, criminal investigators, the Texas Ranger involved in the case, Corpus Christi police, and fire crews who helped recover the remains from the ravine. And to be fair, that coordination likely prevented the case from becoming even more complicated than it already was. Because without the welfare check, there is no early response. Without the bloody items in the trash, there may be less urgency. Without the vehicle tracking, the suspects might have gone much farther. Without the interview, there may be no confession, and without that confession, the ravine might have kept it secret longer. That is what makes the case feel so unsettlingly fragile. It could have unfolded differently. It could have taken far longer. It could have left investigators searching open country with almost nothing to go on. Instead, a chain of small discoveries, quick decisions, and interagency coordination pulled the truth to the surface in just a matter of hours. But what surfaced was awful. A mother dead, a stepfather dead, a daughter accused, a second suspect accused, two children in the vehicle, a home turned into a crime scene, and a ravine near Medina Lake turned into a burial site. There are cases that shock people because they are chaotic and explosive. Then there are cases like this, cases that feel almost quiet in the way they unfold. Quiet house, quiet road, quiet ravine. No dramatic public confrontation, no long chase, no mystery suspect hiding in the dark for weeks. Just a series of calm, terrible facts, each one colder than the last. That coldness is why this story stays with people. Because if the allegations are true, this was not just violence. It was violence followed by concealment, followed by movement, followed by an attempt to carry on long enough to get away. And yet, in the end, it all came undone because someone noticed one absence. Stephen didn't come to work. That was it. That was the thread. Pull that one thread, and everything behind it started collapsing. The home, the lie, the drive to Corpus Christi, the ravine, the bags, the bodies, the charges. A double homicide investigation began with an unanswered phone call and ended with one of the most disturbing accusations imaginable. A woman allegedly confessing to the murders of her own mother and stepfather. And even now, after the arrests, after the recovery of the bodies, after the charges, one question remains heavier than all the rest. Not how they were found, not where the suspects were caught, not what was taken from home. But why? Why this family? Why this way? Why this coldly? Because until that question is fully answered, the case remains more than just a crime story. It becomes something more disturbing, a reminder that sometimes the darkest acts do not arrive with warning signs everyone can see. Sometimes they sit behind an ordinary front door, in an ordinary home, on an ordinary day. And sometimes the first sign that something terrible has happened is simply that someone never made it to work.